This lecture is on the first half of the chapter Exercise and the Immune System. We'll begin with an overview of the immune system. Okay, almost everything in your environment teems with microbes, so door handles, mobile phones, office kitchens, railings, poles, food. Also the air may contain microbes and viruses. So the human immune system is composed of organs, tissues, and cells that protect the body from pathogens. Pathogens are defined as a disease-causing agent, such as a virus, a bacterium, or a fungus. It could also be a parasite. And shown here in this figure, you can see the relative sizes, which is kind of useful, of different pathogens. So for example, here you have a red blood cell. Next to that, you have a bacterium, which I believe is E. coli. So the E. coli is a bacterium. It's much smaller. And then here's the bacterium. And relative to the bacterium, you have viruses, which are much, much smaller. The smallpox virus is actually relatively large, but the other ones are much smaller. Your immune system consists of two parts, an innate system and an acquired system. The acquired system is also called an adaptive system. The innate system is the system you're born with. So this is strong right away at birth. The acquired system, though, develops over your lifetime as you encounter specific pathogens. So, for example, if you encounter one particular virus in one season and then you encounter the same virus the next season, you'll already have, or a similar virus, you may already have some ability to fight off that virus. And it's actually been, it's kind of a cute picture of a child, but it's been hypothesized that children do tend to put things in their mouths. They're always playing with toys and immediately they'll stick them in the mouth. So I don't know if it's just a joke, but it's definitely been hypothesized by people when they see that maybe they're trying to strengthen their immune system by testing out the various microbes in the environment. The innate immune system can be divided into two lines of defense, external and internal. The external innate immunity prevents infections. So this consists of things like your skin, which physically act as a physical barrier. The mucous membranes inside your mouth, things like that, the lining of your respiratory system, all these, and we'll talk about them in more detail in a second, but they prevent the pathogens from actually entering in your body. And then there's the internal innate immunity system, and this confronts pathogens and make it past this external defense. This is a diagram from your book. It shows the innate immune system can be divided into the external system, which consists of physical barriers, such as the skin, mucous membranes, which include the respiratory tract, reproductive tract, and digestive tract. And the second half is internal. So this is composed of cellular components, which includes things like phagocytes. These are cells that actually phagocytize or engulf things like bacteria, and natural killer cells. And we'll talk about those in a second. And the other internal component are complement proteins. These are proteins that also help with the immune function. Your skin forms an important component of your external innate defense. You have living cells, and on top of those living cells, you have a layer of dead cells, which have been keratinized, meaning they have a lot of the protein keratin. And so the amount of keratin depends a bit on the area of the skin. So for example, on the back of your hand, there's a layer of keratinized cells there, but it's thicker on the palms of your hand and then very thick on, say, the soles of your feet. In addition to skin, your external innate defenses include nostril hairs that filter air, earwax that traps pathogens, and natural oils in the skin that also act as a type of chemical barrier that prevents skin from dehydrating too much, but also prevents the entry of certain chemicals through your skin. While the skin is an extremely important part of the external innate defense, we often forget about the fact that we actually, in some sense, expose much more of our body through the mucous membranes. So these mucous membranes line the respiratory tracts going into the lungs. They line the digestive tract, which of course passes through your whole body, and the genitourinary tracts. So they actually make up a huge amount of surface area. So these are important membranes. And these membranes, as the name implies, secrete mucus. And mucus protects the skin, the membrane in various ways. One is it prevents, for example, if you think of the digestive tract, it prevents the digestive tract from being injured by food particles or by acid from the acidic hydrochloric acid within the stomach. And the mucus can also support functions such as the movement of bacteria out of the body. So, for example, within the respiratory system, normally we have nice healthy cilia as well as mucus producing cells. And so the mucus is very sticky, and it'll attach to bacteria. And then this makes it much easier for the cilia, which move in a wave-like fashion, to move these bacteria up and out of the respiratory tract. And generally the mucus would then be swallowed, and your body's in your digestive tract would then take care of these bacteria with the acid and digestive enzymes in the stomach. The internal innate defense is composed of two parts: the white blood cells, which is the cellular system, and defensive proteins, which is referred to as the complement system. White blood cells are also called leukocytes. So the term leukos means white or clear in Greek, and cyte simply refers to cell. So these white blood cells recognize and remove foreign invaders, such as bacteria. So we can ask the question, where do leukocytes come from? Well, all blood cells, white and red, are produced by multipotent cells known as hematopoietic stem cells, which are found in red bone marrow. And so red bone marrow would be found in various places, such as in the ribs, in the vertebrae, the sternum, I believe the pelvis also. The hematopoietic stem cells found in red bone marrow can essentially go in two different routes. They can go the lymphoid route, so they can become lymphoid progenitor cells, and then they can develop into B cells, T cells, or natural killer cells. So these are collectively referred to as lymphocytes. The other route they can go is the myeloid progenitor cell. And the final mature cells will be red blood cells, neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, monocytes, which can mature into macrophages, which are phagocytotic cells. Neutrophils are also able to phagocytize bacteria. And then we have megakaryocytes, which can mature into platelets, which are cell fragments that are involved in blood clotting. Immune cells are able to consume bacteria in a process called phagocytosis. There are two key types of phagocytes: macrophages and neutrophils. So recall that a macrophage develops from a monocyte, and then we have neutrophils also up here. So the process looks something like this. You can see that there are bacteria will present certain proteins and carbohydrates on its surface. The phagocytotic cell will recognize those markers, and this will trigger the cell to absorb the cell or phagocytize the cell. And then the bacteria is then broken down with digestive enzymes within the cell. As I mentioned earlier, macrophages are derived from monocytes. So the monocytes actually move through the bloodstream, and they'll be triggered to leave the blood, and then they mature into macrophages. So you can see that process here. Here's a monocyte. It's passing through the endothelium of a blood vessel, and it ends up becoming a mature macrophage. So then the macrophages can be located in tissues throughout the body. These are referred to as professional phagocytes. When they destroy bacteria, they give off chemicals that lead to an increase in blood flow. So that's part of the inflammation process. The increased blood flow will bring more leukocytes to the infected area. And this can be a rapid response system in which more and more leukocytes arrive, including other macrophages, which could release more chemicals, thereby increasing blood flow and bring even more leukocytes to the area. Macrophages also produce cytokines that serve as a chemoattractant. As I mentioned earlier, neutrophils are the other type of phagocytatic cell. They're referred to as professional phagocytes that are on call in the blood. After being summoned to an infected area, they exit the blood and become activated. These activated neutrophils give off chemicals that increase blood flow also, as macrophages do. And the neutrophils also produce cytokines that bring even more leukocytes to the infected area. So you can see a picture of a neutrophil exiting the blood, entering into the interstitial space, and now it's going around hunting and looking for bacteria to phagocytize. And these rods are supposed to indicate bacteria. And it's also releasing cytokines into the immediate area. Another part of the innate defense system are natural killer cells. So these are cells that were derived from lymphoid progenitor cells. So these are a little bit unusual because the B and the T cells, as we'll see in a second, are actually involved in the acquired immune defense system. Now, these cells are found in blood. They're found in the liver and the spleen. They circulate in the blood throughout the body, and they detect abnormal surface proteins that are typical of virus-infected cells and cancerous cells. So these cells are not phagocytotic. They do not engulf the stricken cells. Instead, they release chemicals that lead to the cell death, and this inhibits the further spread of the virus or cancer. A very important part of the innate immune system is inflammation. Inflammation occurs often locally in an area of, say, skin or the body that's under attack, in a sense. And so inflammation is due to macrophages, neutrophils, and natural killer cells that are essentially activated. They release chemical messengers called cytokines, which will cause things like an increased blood flow to an area. So you'll see that inflammation is characterized by redness. That indicates increased blood flow. Swelling, which is also referred to as edema. That's, again, a consequence of increased blood flow to a given area, say, of skin. Heat, that's also due to the vasodilation locally in the capillary bed of, say, skin. That brings more heat or internal heat from within the body to the surface, and therefore the patch of skin that's, say, irritated would generate more heat. And also there's often pain associated with inflammation. And inflammation is not just on the surface of the skin. It can also occur with mucous membranes. And so, for example, within the nasal cavity, you would have an increase of mucus production. Inflammation can also lead to things like productive cough, meaning you have more mucus being generated within the respiratory tract. And so that then leads to cough, in which you produce phlegm. So scientists and doctors figured out a number of years ago that in addition to antibodies, there are certain proteins that seem to increase the effectiveness of antibodies. And so they were complementary to antibodies, and therefore they were given the name the complement system. So these are defensive proteins that are part of the innate immune system. It consists of small proteins that are synthesized by the liver and circulate in the blood as inactive precursors. When these proteins are stimulated, they can then attach to the surface of a foreign agent. And there's three things they can do. These complement proteins can form a hole in the surface of a bacterium. Water then enters into the bacterium. The bacterium swells due to the water entry and then bursts or lyses. Secondly, complement proteins can tag the surface of a bacterium, identifying it for phagocytes to then engulf and destroy. And thirdly, the complement proteins can serve as chemoattractants, and they can recruit more immune cells, such as other leukocytes and so forth, to an area. This is an illustration of how complement proteins aid in the attack of a bacterium. In this particular case, we see the binding of antibodies to antigens on the surface of a foreign cell. We can assume this is a bacterium. So the antibodies are here. They attach to the antigen. A complement protein is then able to attach to the antibody. And these complement proteins can then attack the cell membrane. They can form pores. Once they form a complete pore, water is then and salts are able to enter into the bacterium. The bacterium then swells up, increases the cell volume. Eventually, it lyses or breaks apart. And so this is a very effective way for the complement proteins to then attack a cell. And you notice a key feature of this figure, which is really nice, is that it shows that two systems are working together. The innate system, which is these complement proteins, working together with an acquired immune response that involves antibodies. And we'll talk more about antibodies in a second. Okay, inflammation is a normal part of the immune response. And there are two types of inflammation, acute and more chronic inflammation. So acute inflammation is generally a good thing. So for example, if you were to cut your finger, you'd have an acute inflammation response. This would be a short-term response. You'd have vasodilation. And this is due to bradykinins, which are released from phagocytes, such as macrophages and neutrophils. You'd also have increased blood flow to the injured area, causing edema. So for example, if you are injured and you also have an infection, say in your arm, it could swell up quite a bit. You could have pretty substantial swelling, and that's because of this increased blood flow to the area. And fluid then leaks through the capillary walls into the interstitial space around cells, leading to swelling. Here's a picture to illustrate what I was just talking about. If you had a splinter and the splinter was dirty, so there were bacteria on it, immediately within the local area, there will be cells that will release chemical signals. And these chemical signals will activate white blood cells that are in the circulating the blood to then enter into this local area. The white blood cells, they could be macrophages or neutrophils, and they're phagocytotic, so they'll engulf the bacteria and destroy them. And they themselves can release more chemical messages, such as cytokines, in the local area, which can increase blood flow to the area and increase the recruitment of even more leukocytes or white blood cells to the area. Finally, in the last stage, the phagocytotic cells will destroy all the bacteria. They'll also destroy cellular debris from cells that have been damaged. And the healing process will continue until essentially the skin is, the breach in the skin is repaired. In contrast to acute inflammation, there's also a condition in which you could have chronic inflammation. This may be due to a persistent infection, or it could be some sort of prolonged immune response, such as rheumatoid arthritis. So in chronic inflammation, you have increased circulation of cytokines. You also have increased circulation of C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein is a protein made by the liver. In conditions of inflammation, these levels tend to go up. So there are different types of chronic inflammation. You can have high-grade inflammation. So again, rheumatoid arthritis might lead to that, a high level of inflammation. Certain cancers will also lead to high-grade inflammation. More common is low-grade inflammation. The risk factors are obesity and aging. So as people get older, they tend to have more low-grade inflammation. It's not entirely clear that aging causes it. It may also have to do with lack of exercise and perhaps poor diet. And it's possible that low-grade inflammation may increase the risk for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's disease. Up to this point, we've innate immune system. This is the system that you're born with, and that is very strong right away from birth. However, there's a problem with the innate immune system, which is that it can't eliminate many viruses. So viruses have a tendency to mutate very quickly. And so they present different surface antigens. And these can be very different from one season to the next. So there's really no way to pre-program the body to recognize the vast diversity of viruses. And so for this reason, you have invertebrates, you tend to see vertebrates have an acquired immune system. This is also called an adaptive immune system. And again, that's the system I showed the picture earlier of the cute kid putting toys in her mouth. So this is a system that infants may be testing out by putting objects in their mouth and essentially ingesting bacteria. So this system is able to recognize and remember certain pathogens. And there are basically two main types of cells involved in this. There's B cells, also called B lymphocytes, and T cells, also called T lymphocytes. The function of B cells is to secrete antibodies. Antibodies are proteins. They're also referred to as immunoglobulins, and there are 5 classes. And these fight against foreign antigens. And again, antigens are anything that's detected. It's a substance that stimulates the immune system to produce antibodies. So, for example, bacteria would have surface antigens, viruses would have surface antigens, fungi, toxins, and even parasites all have something on their surface, such as carbohydrates, proteins, and so forth on the cell surfaces that are going to stimulate an immune response, and those would be considered to be antigens. So how do antibodies work? Well, they can work in various ways. One way is to interfere with the pathogen activity through a process called neutralization. So shown here is a virus. It's exhibiting certain antigens, and the body here has responded by generating antibodies. And these antibodies then bind to the virus. And if you have enough of these binding to the outer proteins and carbohydrates of the virus, it may actually block the ability of the virus to bind and infect a host cell. Antibodies can also work by binding to antigens on bacteria. And these antibodies would then serve as a signal to a macrophage or other type of phagocytotic cell, such as a neutrophil. And these would then engulf the bacteria and destroy them. And previously, we talked about antibodies and how they can work with proteins of the complement system. Recall that they can attack a cell, and then with the aid of the complement proteins, put essentially a pore in the bacterial cell wall, cell membrane, leading to the cell swelling up and lysing. Okay, so we mentioned that B cells generate antibodies. There are also T cells, which are also part of the acquired immune system. These are called T cells because they mature in the thymus. The thymus is located here in the body. And T cells have various functions. They can recognize protein antigens. So, for example, there are killer T cells, which are also referred as cytotoxic T cells. Cyto refers to cell, and toxic means something that's toxic, and so it will destroy cells. And so what they do is they will eventually detect virus-infected cells or sometimes cancer cells and then kill them. There are also helper T cells. These secrete cytokines that enhance the immune response. And finally, there are regulatory T cells. These prevent the immune system from attacking the body's normal antigens. So these killer T cells, or cytotoxic T cells, kill infected host cells. By host cells, I mean these would be cells within your body, so your own cells. So sometimes what happens is a cell will become infected with a virus, and at that point, it's essentially hopeless. The cell is just been turned over into a virus factory. And so the best thing to do is to simply just destroy that cell, even though it's part of your own body. And so these cytotoxic T cells will be able to recognize these virus-infected cells, and they'll bind to them. And what they then do is secrete two types of proteins. One is called perforin. And so perforin is released, and what it does will actually form pores in the cell. And this will then allow for water and salts to enter the cell, and the cell will swell up and lyse. In other words, it would break apart. Now, at the same time, so that's sort of like, one mode of attack. At the same time, the killer T cell or cytotoxic T cell will release granzymes. So granzymes are enzymes that break down proteins, and when they enter into a cell, they'll induce apoptosis, which is controlled cell death in the target cell. So essentially a signal to this target cell, hey, your time's up. You're going to have to essentially commit suicide and go through apoptosis. So this then kills the host cell, which would seem bad, but now this has prevented the virus from, replicating as many copies. And actually, as this dying cell breaks apart, it releases a lot of these virus malformed or half-formed virus coat particles and so forth. And that's actually fantastic, because those can then be detected by the acquired immune system, and it can develop further antibodies to the virus particles. Okay, so here are some of the take-home messages. The human immune system is complex, and it's a redundant system designed to protect us from invading pathogens. The healthy immune system requires a teamwork of two layers of protection: the innate immune system and the acquired immune system. The innate immune system provides the first line of defense against foreign invaders and is composed of three major components: the physical barriers, such as skin, mucous membranes that line our respiratory, digestive, and genitourinary tracts. It also is composed of specialized cells, such as phagocytes, and then natural killer cells that destroy invaders. Finally, there's a group of proteins called the complement system, which are located throughout the body and help to protect against invaders. And we talked about how this complement system can actually work together with antibodies very effectively to destroy cells, invading cells such as bacteria. Now, as we mentioned, there's a problem with the innate immune system, which is it's really not very effective against viruses. And so you have a second system called the acquired immune system. And this system adapts to protect against almost any type of invading pathogen. Its primary purpose, the primary purpose of the acquired immune system, is to provide protection against viruses that the innate system cannot provide. B and T cells are the major cells involved in the acquired immune system. B cells produce antibodies, whereas T cells specialize in recognizing and removing antigens in the body. Here's a table from your book. We focus primarily on neutrophils. Remember, these are phagocytotic. They can also release chemicals in the local area of which lead to inflammation. So these chemicals or cytokines will lead to vasodilation. They can also lead to There are also chemotaxins. These are chemicals that attract more leukocytes to an area of infection. So basophils we didn't really talk about, but these release chemicals such as histamine that are involved in inflammation. So recall, you've probably seen in the pharmacy antihistamines. Those would be chemicals that block the response due to histamine, so they block inflammation. Eosinophils are another one we didn't really talk about, but these destroy multicellular parasites. They're involved in hypersensitivity reactions, for example, allergic reactions. So monocytes we did talk about. These are precursors to macrophages. Macrophages are a very important type of phagocytotic cell, and that's part of the innate immune system. Megakaryocytes are precursors of platelets. So platelets are important for blood clotting. Now, the book says this isn't part of immune function, but I would argue it actually is. When you have, say, a breach of the skin, you want to have platelets and blood clotting right away. And that forms part of the physical barrier that prevents further bacteria from entering into the body. Okay, we did talk about B cells. These are also called B lymphocytes. They're part of the acquired immune system. They initiate, they essentially form antibodies. So they generate antibodies and secrete them into the blood. Okay, we'll move on. So T cells are also called T lymphocytes. These are also part of the acquired immune system. So there are several different types of T cells, and they participate in cell-mediated responses of the acquired immune system. And finally, we also talked about natural killer cells. These are also part of the innate system. They essentially recognize virus-infected cells or cancer cells, and then they essentially bind to them, and they function to kill these cells.